December 22nd, 1944. 11:30 a.m. Bastogne, Belgium. The very air seemed frozen, each exhale a plume of white vapor, as Lieutenant Colonel Harry Card watched 4 German officers materialize through the snow-swept landscape, their white flag a stark surrender against the ruins of war. They bore a message destined to resonate through the ages, an ultimatum dripping with the arrogant certainty of an already won victory. The fortunes of war are shifting. This time, the American forces within and around Bastogne have been tightly encircled by formidable German armored formations. A single path remains to spare the entrapped U.S. troops from utter annihilation: the honorable surrender of the beleaguered town. The German emissaries stood with an air of supreme confidence, and they had every justification to feel so. A force of 18,000 Americans was caught in a trap, ringed by an estimated 30,000 German soldiers and their hundreds of tanks. All supply lines were severed. The hostile weather had shackled the entire Allied Air Force to the ground. The closest friendly reinforcements were more than 100 miles distant. What they could not possibly comprehend was that 130 miles to the south, General George S. Patton had just uttered a promise so audacious, so utterly bold, that even Eisenhower suspected he was jesting. It was a promise that demanded the movement of an entire army across impassable winter terrain, at a speed no military force had ever before achieved. The very arithmetic of warfare was on the verge of being rewritten, not by the weight of numbers or superior technology, but by the impending clash of German hubris with raw American resolve, and by the sheer, unyielding audacity of a general who refused to acknowledge the existence of the word impossible. The transformation had ignited 6 days prior in the deep, pre-dawn blackness of December 16, 1944. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest exploded with a ferocity unseen on the Western Front since the dark days of 1940. A staggering 1,600 German artillery pieces roared to life as one along an 80-mile front, their shells shrieking through the crystalline air towards unsuspecting American lines. Caught in this maelstrom was Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 99th Infantry Division, who would later etch in his diary, "The ground heaved beneath our feet. Trees disintegrated into a storm of splinters. The air itself felt as though it was screaming. They told us the Germans were defeated. They had told us a lie." This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's final desperate roll of the dice to turn the tide of the war. Under a cloak of absolute secrecy, the Wehrmacht had gathered a colossal force of 410,000 men, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 pieces of artillery. This immense host had been stealthily moved through the thick Eifel forests under the cover of night, enforcing strict radio silence and employing horses to haul supplies to muffle the sound of engines. General Major Heinz Kokott, leading the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, captured the charged moments before the assault. The soldiers stood as silent statues in the gloom, their breath forming frozen clouds before them. They understood the stakes. This was more than just another offensive. This was their last hope. Their target was the most vulnerable section of the Allied line, a sector thinly held by 4 American divisions spread across challenging terrain, many of them green troops or units still recovering from previous battles. The Germans achieved absolute tactical surprise. In a matter of hours, entire American units were either annihilated or sent reeling in disarray. Yet the German strategy hinged on one indispensable element: speed. They had to seize the crucial road hub of Bastogne within a mere 48 hours. 7 vital roads converged on this town, arteries that the German panzers desperately needed to reach their ultimate prize, the port of Antwerp, 125 miles away. Deprived of Bastogne, the entire German offensive would grind to a halt. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz was in command of the 47th Panzer Corps, the force charged with capturing Bastogne. His command was formidable, boasting the elite 2nd Panzer Division with its 88 tanks and assault guns, the battle-hardened Panzer Lehr Division with 57 tanks, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division with its 17,000 infantrymen. Speeding towards that very same objective from the opposite direction was the 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles. They had been in Reims, France, recuperating from 72 grueling days of combat in Holland when the urgent summons arrived. There was no winter gear, no time for preparations. The orders were simple. Grab your weapons and get on the trucks. December 17, 9:20 p.m. The temperature had plunged to a bitter 14 degrees as the initial convoy of trucks, packed with soldiers of the 101st Airborne, carved its way through the darkness toward Bastogne. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment recalled the journey with chilling clarity. We drove past unending columns of American soldiers moving in the other direction, in full retreat. Some were without weapons. Many had lost their helmets. They yelled at us from the shadows, "Turn back! Turn back! They'll slaughter you all!" One soldier, his eyes wide with sheer terror, gripped my arm and whispered, "There are thousands of them. Tigers, panthers, all of them." I shoved him off. We were not turning back. The convoy snaked for miles, a line of 380 trucks transporting the division through the freezing night. They were driving into an abyss of uncertainty. Maps were a rarity. Intelligence reports were a confusing mess of contradictions. The only thing they knew for certain was their mission: reach Bastogne before the Germans did. The 101st Airborne Division possessed an effective fighting force of 805 officers and 11,035 enlisted men, for a total of 11,140 soldiers. This force comprised 4 infantry regiments, the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments, alongside the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, supported by 4 artillery battalions and various other units. The leading elements of the 501st PIR arrived in Bastogne at 11:30 p.m. on December 18th, having won the race against the main German force by a mere handful of hours. Team des Sobres, a combat team from the 10th Armored Division under the command of Major William des Sobres, had already thrown up a roadblock at Neuville, 3 miles north of Bastogne. At first light on December 19th, they made their first violent contact with the German spearheads. Sergeant William McCloskey, a tank commander with Team des Sobres, recounted the initial clash. "The fog was a wall of white. You couldn't see 50 yards ahead. Then we heard it, the deep guttural growl of German armor. When the first Panther tank emerged from that mist, it looked like a prehistoric beast. Our 75mm shells just ricocheted off its frontal armor like harmless toys. We had to let them get dangerously close, so close we could smell their exhaust, to hit their vulnerable sides. The fight for Neuville became a day-long inferno. Team des Sobres, with its meager 15 Sherman tanks, stood defiant against the entire might of the 2nd Panzer Division. They held their ground for 48 brutal hours, knocking out 31 German tanks before receiving the order to pull back. Major des Sobres was gravely wounded when a German shell slammed into his command post, but his unit's incredible sacrifice had purchased invaluable time. December 20th saw the arrival of a new commander in Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe stepped in to assume temporary command of the 101st Airborne, as Maxwell Taylor was in Washington. McAuliffe, an artilleryman by trade, was renowned for his unflappable calm under immense pressure. He would need every shred of that composure in the days that lay ahead. The situation map in McAuliffe's headquarters painted a terrifying picture. German forces were systematically closing the ring from 3 sides. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was seeping in from the south and east. The Panzer Lehr was driving hard from the east. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division loomed as a threat from the north. By midday on December 20th, the final artery into Bastogne, the highway to Neufchâteau, was severed. Captain Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th PIR, placed his men in their foxholes ringing the perimeter. We could hear the clanking and rumbling of German tanks maneuvering in the darkness just beyond our lines. The men were frantically digging their foxholes deeper, resorting to helmets and their bare, bleeding hands when entrenching tools shattered against the iron-hard frozen earth. The temperature was hovering near zero. Already, men's feet were turning a deathly black from frostbite. Within Bastogne, The civilian population of 3,000 sought refuge in cellars as German artillery began its methodical demolition of the town. Renée Lemaire, a 30-year-old Belgian nurse, worked with tireless devotion in the aid station on Rue de Neufchâteau, tending to the wounds of both American and German soldiers. She would not live to see the end of the siege. The defenders of Bastogne now consisted of approximately 18,000 men. This included the 101st Airborne Division with its 11,240 soldiers, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division under Colonel William Roberts, with about 40 operational tanks and 2,800 men, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion with their swift M18 Hellcats, the all-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion, and an assortment of other artillery and support units. December 21st broke with visibility choked to less than 100 yards. A dense fog mingled with falling snow, wrapping the world in a white shroud that rendered movement almost impossible. The U.S. Army Meteorological Report classified the conditions as extremely adverse for any military operations. For the Germans, this weather was a divine gift. It grounded the Allied fighter-bombers that had been a reign of terror upon German columns since D-Day. Oberstleutnant von Lauchert, commanding elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, noted, "The weather is our greatest ally. Without their airplanes, the Americans are merely men, just like us, and we possess more tanks." But the weather was a double-edged sword. German tanks churned and struggled in the thick mud created by the repeating cycles of freezing and thawing. Fuel consumption skyrocketed as vehicles battled the mire. Supply trucks skidded and jackknifed on treacherous ice-coated roads. Wounded men froze to death where they fell before medical aid could ever reach them. Inside the Bastogne perimeter, ammunition supplies were shrinking to dangerously low levels. The artillery was severely rationed to a mere 10 rounds per gun each day. Medical supplies were all but gone following the capture of the medical company on December 19th. Morphine was now reserved only for the most catastrophically injured. Food rations were slashed to a single meager meal per day. Private First Class James Sims of the 101st would later remember, "We were reduced to eating snow just for water." The buddy next to me in my foxhole had his feet frozen solid inside his boots. When the medic finally had to cut the boots away, his toes came off with them. He didn't even make a sound. He was beyond the point of feeling anything. 130 miles to the south of Bastogne, at Verdun, a starkly different drama was playing out on December 19th. Inside a cold, damp French barracks, warmed by a single pot-bellied stove, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had convened an emergency council of his senior commanders. The room was thick with the most senior leadership of the Allied forces: Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, and Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's Chief of Intelligence, had just concluded his grim briefing on the German breakthrough. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the room. Eisenhower shattered it with words that would come to define the American counterstroke. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table." Patton's face immediately split into a wide grin. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the sons of bitches go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut 'em off and chew 'em up." Eisenhower's expression turned serious. "George, I need you to attack north. How quickly can you disengage from your current offensive and pivot toward Bastogne?" What Patton declared next left every single officer in the room utterly flabbergasted. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room erupted with incredulity. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder actually let out a laugh. To move an entire corps 90 degrees in the dead of winter, across 100 miles of ice-slicked roads, in just 48 hours? It was preposterous. Eisenhower's face grew red. "Don't be fatuous, George. If you try to move that quickly, you won't have all 3 divisions ready, and you'll attack piecemeal. You'll be annihilated." But Patton was not making an idle boast. For 3 days, his brilliant operations officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been warning him about the ominous German buildup in the Ardennes. Patton had already directed his staff to prepare 3 distinct operational plans for this exact scenario. He had already staged forward depots of fuel, ammunition, and medical units along potential northern routes. "I am not being fatuous, Ike," Patton retorted calmly. "I have already issued the preliminary orders. My staff is currently working on 3 possible axes of advance. All I need is your go-ahead." He unfolded a map and pointed out the routes to Eisenhower. "I'll commit Milliken's 3 corps. The 4th Armored will spearhead the attack, followed by the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions. We will strike them from Arlon and drive straight through to Bastogne." Eisenhower peered at the map. The distance was immense. The weather was atrocious. The roads were sheets of solid ice. But the defenders of Bastogne had to be relieved. "When can you begin?" "The morning of December 22nd. "Do it." As Patton exited the meeting, he placed a call to his headquarters and uttered a prearranged code phrase: "Play ball." Those 2 simple words initiated one of the most astonishing operational pivots in the annals of military history. Within hours, 133,000 vehicles began their relentless crawl north. The entire Third Army, a force of 250,000 men, had to be completely reoriented. Supply depots that had been carefully positioned for an eastward offensive into Germany had to be uprooted and relocated. 20,000 miles of telephone wire had to be relayed. Artillery positions calculated for one direction of fire had to be entirely recalculated for another. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, received his orders at 7 p.m. on December 19th. His unit was tasked with moving 150 miles in just 19 hours, straight through a blizzard. "We drove with blackout lights through the endless night," he later recounted. Tank commanders stood exposed in their turrets, freezing to the bone, trying to guide drivers who were virtually blind to the road. Men were falling asleep on their feet and had to be physically shaken awake. The logistical challenge was staggering. Every Sherman tank burned through 175 gallons of fuel for the journey. The division required 50,000 gallons just to get to the starting line of the attack. Fuel trucks drove in a non-stop convoy, with many sliding off the icy roads into ditches. When a truck broke down, fuel had to be transferred by hand, using 5-gallon jerry cans. Master Sergeant Frank Curcio of the 4th Armored's Maintenance Company worked for 72 consecutive hours. "We were changing track blocks on tanks while they were still rolling into position. Men's hands would freeze to the cold metal. We had instances where skin tore off when they tried to pull their hands away, but not a single man stopped. We all knew those paratroopers in Bastogne were depending on us." Back in Bastogne, the situation had escalated to a critical point. The defensive perimeter had been compressed to a fragile line of less than 16 miles. German artillery had precisely registered every key defensive position. The aid stations were overflowing with the wounded. At 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd, 4 German officers approached the American lines, protected by a white flag. They were intercepted by soldiers from F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The German delegation included Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps, Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of the Panzer Operations Section, and 2 enlisted men from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Major Wagner was carrying a typed ultimatum on 2 separate sheets, one in English and one in German. The English version had been typed on an English typewriter, with German diacritical marks painstakingly added by hand. Upon being brought to the command post, the message was rushed to General McAuliffe, who was trying to catch a few moments of sleep in the basement of the Belgian barracks that served as his headquarters. When Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore woke him with the news, "The Germans have sent some officers forward to accept our surrender," McAuliffe's instant, unthinking response was, "Nuts." His staff clustered around him as he read the full German message aloud. It spoke of the hopeless position of the American forces, warning that German artillery is ready to annihilate the USA troops, and that only surrender could spare them from total annihilation. Colonel Moore inquired what their formal reply should be. McAuliffe seemed genuinely perplexed. "Well, I don't know what to tell them." It was Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard who spoke up. "What you said initially would be very hard to top, General." McAuliffe chuckled. "You mean nuts?" The room erupted in unanimous agreement. McAuliffe sat down and scribbled the response that would achieve legendary status. To the German commander. Nuts. The American commander. When Colonel Joseph Harper delivered this reply to the waiting German officers, they were utterly bewildered. Nuts? What does this signify? Harper could not help but relish the moment. It means go to hell. And I will tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German who tries to break into this city. Major Wagner's posture stiffened. We will kill many Americans. This is war. On your way, bud, Harper retorted. And good luck to you. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, would later concede that he was surprised the ultimatum had even been dispatched. Panzer Lehr Division sent a parliamentarian to Bastogne without my authorization. The demand to surrender was refused, as was to be expected. The German answer to McAuliffe's defiant retort was immediate and savage. That evening, the Luftwaffe unleashed its first major bombing raid on Bastogne. For the defenders huddled in their foxholes, it was a terrifying glimpse of hell. Corporal Walter Gordon of Easy Company described the bombardment. The ground trembled like it was an earthquake. Trees exploded into fireballs. Shrapnel whizzed through the air like a swarm of angry hornets. We just pressed ourselves into the frozen earth and prayed. The temperature plunged to nearly 10 degrees Celsius. In the foxholes that ringed the perimeter, men had to take turns sleeping to keep from freezing to death. They learned to urinate into empty ration cans rather than risk leaving the relative safety of their holes. Exposure for even a few minutes could result in death from a sniper's bullet or crippling frostbite. The food situation had grown desperate. The official ration was a single K ration per day, providing about 2,800 calories when the men desperately needed 4,000 to combat the extreme cold. Soldiers discovered they could save the wax-coated cardboard from the ration boxes. It would burn just long enough to melt a canteen cup of snow into drinkable water. Technical Sergeant Donald Malarkey devised a creative, if grim, solution. We found that the dead German horses, and there were hundreds of them, were frozen completely solid, like fresh meat. We would hack off chunks with our bayonets and cook them over small fires made from broken ammunition crates. It tasted awful, but it kept us from starving. December 24th delivered both hope and horror to the defenders of Bastogne. The sky had finally begun to clear, sparking hope for an aerial resupply. But the clear skies also allowed the Luftwaffe to launch its most devastating raid of the siege. At 8:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, German bombers materialized over the shattered town. One of their bombs scored a direct hit on the aid station where René Lemaire was working. The building imploded, trapping dozens of wounded soldiers and medical staff inside. Corporal Kenneth Moore was just outside when the bomb struck. I heard the massive explosion and ran toward the building. Where the aid station had stood was now just a mountain of rubble. We could hear voices from underneath, men crying out for help, calling for their mothers. We dug with our bare hands all through the night, pulling out bodies. Miss Lemaire was among the dead. She had refused to leave the wounded who were too injured to be moved. 30 American soldiers perished in that single bombing, along with the Belgian nurse who had become a beacon of hope for the wounded. Augusta Chiwi, a Congolese-Belgian nurse, miraculously survived and continued to treat the wounded for 30 straight hours after the bombing. As Christmas Eve bled into Christmas Day, Patton's Third Army was battling its way through blizzard conditions. The attack, which had commenced on December 22nd, was falling behind schedule. The 4th Armored Division had managed to advance only 7 miles in 3 grueling days. Patton, a man who never favored conventional military solutions, had summoned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, on December 22nd. "Chaplain, I want you to publish a prayer for good weather. I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if you can't get God to work on our side." O'Neill was skeptical. "Sir, it's going to take a pretty thick rug for that kind of praying." "I don't care if it takes a flying carpet," Patton shot back. "I want you to get up a prayer for good weather." The prayer was printed on 250,000 cards and handed out to every soldier in the Third Army. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee of Thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains, with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Whether it was divine intervention or a simple meteorological coincidence, December 23rd dawned brilliantly clear. For the first time in a week, the sun sliced through the heavy clouds. The break in the weather was nothing short of miraculous. After 7 days of impenetrable fog and snow, visibility suddenly expanded to 10 miles. The temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in a week. Most critically, the Allied air forces could finally take to the skies. At 9:50 a.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft appeared over Bastogne, trailing colored smoke to designate the drop zones. By 11:50 a.m., the sky was swarming with C-47 transport planes, 241 of them flying in perfect majestic formation. Sergeant Jack Agnew of the Pathfinder team recalled, "We popped purple smoke to mark the drop zone. Then we heard them, a low drone that swelled into a deafening roar. The sky literally went dark with aircraft. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen." The paratroopers in Bastogne erupted in euphoric cheers. Men clambered out of their foxholes, waving their helmets, many with tears of relief carving paths down their grimy faces. For 7 long days they had been utterly alone. Now the heavens were filled with salvation. The first parachutes blossomed open at 11:55 a.m. A rain of life-saving supplies began to descend. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, blankets, and most crucially, artillery shells. Of the 1,146 bundles dropped, an astonishing 95% were successfully retrieved. Captain James Parker of the 101st G4 Logistics Section orchestrated the recovery effort. Men ran directly through artillery fire to grab those bundles. I saw one private get hit by shrapnel, struggle back to his feet, and drag a bundle to cover with blood streaming down his face. But the Germans had not been sitting idle. Anti-aircraft guns positioned around Bastogne opened up a furious barrage. The C-47s were forced to fly straight and level at a vulnerable 1,000 feet to ensure an accurate drop. They were sitting ducks. By December 26th, aircraft had delivered 1,020.7 tons of supplies by parachute and another 92.4 tons by glider. The largest airlift occurred on December 26th, with 289 planes making the run to Bastogne. At 2:45 a.m. on Christmas morning, German artillery unleashed its heaviest bombardment of the entire siege upon Bastogne. For 2 solid hours, shells rained down on the American positions. Then at 5:30 a.m., 18 Panzer Mark V tanks of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, supported by infantry cloaked in white camouflage, assaulted the western perimeter. The attack was spearheaded by Lieutenant Colonel Wolfgang Mauke. His orders from General Kokot were brutally simple. Bastogne must fall today. It is the Führer's Christmas wish. The German tanks smashed through the first line of foxholes held by Company A of the 327th Glider Infantry. Private First Class Kenneth Hendricks was in the second line. The ground was literally shaking from the tank engines. In the dim dawn light, they looked like mechanical monsters. Our bazooka rounds just bounced right off their armor. But the Americans had positioned their tank destroyers with lethal precision. The M18 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been concealed within the rubble of destroyed buildings. As the German tanks rumbled past, the Hellcats opened fire from their flanks. Sergeant Bill Harper commanded one of these tank destroyers. "We let them roll right past us, then we hit them in the rear where their armor was thinnest." My gunner, Corporal Johnson, was unbelievable. 5 shots, 3 confirmed kills. By 10:00 a.m., all 18 of the German tanks were burning hulks. Nearly 400 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. One captured German officer admitted to his interrogators, "Your defense was magnificent. We knew after this morning that we could not take Bastogne." General McAuliffe issued his Christmas message to the troops, recounting the German demand for surrender and his famous reply, adding, "We have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us from the north, east, south, and west." December 26th, 4 p.m. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the Sherman tank Cobra King of the 37th Tank Battalion, peered through his periscope at the Belgian village of Assenois, just 4 miles from Bastogne. For 4 agonizing days, The 4th Armored Division had been clawing its way through entrenched German positions, advancing yard by bloody yard. The final push began at 2:20 p.m. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams ordered his battalion to charge forward while simultaneously calling for artillery support. "I want every gun you've got," he radioed. Within minutes, 2,340 artillery rounds were screaming down on the German positions around Assenois. Bogus remembered the moment. "I could see German troops scrambling from their foxholes as our artillery barrage walked right through their positions. The second the barrage lifted, Abrams gave the order, 'Move out!' Shame. We charged through at full throttle, every gun blazing." Private James Hendricks, the bowgunner in Cobra King, described the chaotic breakthrough. "We went through that town like a hot knife through butter. Germans were firing at us from windows, doorways, from everywhere. Our 75mm main gun was swinging left and right, firing point-blank into buildings." At 4:50 p.m., Cobra King crested a small rise, and Bogus saw American soldiers ahead. They were engineers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, manning the outer perimeter of Bastogne's defenses. "Come on in," the engineers yelled. "You're the first tanks we've seen in 10 days." Bogus keyed his radio to Abrams. Contact with friendly forces established. The siege was broken, but the price had been terrible. The 37th Tank Battalion had lost 5 men killed, 22 wounded, and 5 missing in action during the breakthrough. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion suffered 30 killed and 180 wounded. But the corridor to Bastogne, though only 400 yards wide, was now open. News of the breakthrough spread through Bastogne like a wildfire. Men who had been carefully conserving every last round of ammunition now fired entire clips into the air in sheer celebration. Wounded soldiers in the aid stations cheered despite their agony. General McAuliffe, maintaining his trademark calm, simply stated, "We're glad to see you boys." But for the Germans, the psychological impact was utterly devastating. General Major Kokot wrote in his diary, "The relief of Bastogne is a disaster, not just tactically, but morally. Our soldiers no longer believe we can achieve victory. They have witnessed American determination firsthand, and it has shattered their spirit." Oberstleutnant Kaufmann of the Panzer Lehr Division was more direct. "We threw everything we had at Bastogne, our finest troops, our last reserves of tanks and ammunition. And for what? They held. And when we demanded their surrender, they laughed in our faces. Nuts." That single word inflicted more damage on German morale than 1,000 bombs. The defenders had begun the siege with approximately 18,000 men. By the time the fighting ended, the 101st Airborne Division's casualties from December 19th to January 6th would amount to 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division sustained roughly 500 casualties. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 108 German armored vehicles while losing only 17 of their Hellcats. German losses around Bastogne were catastrophic. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division suffered over 60% casualties. Panzer Lehr lost 42 of its tanks. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had bypassed Bastogne to drive toward the Meuse River, ran out of fuel just 4 miles short of the river and was subsequently annihilated by the U.S. 2nd Armored Division. December 27th brought even clearer skies, and with them, the full terrifying might of Allied air power. From December 23rd to the 27th, Allied aircraft flew over 34,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe, which had commenced the offensive with 2,000 aircraft, was reduced to fewer than 300 operational planes within a single week. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Klosterman of the RAF flew a Tempest fighter bomber over the battlefield. It was what we called tank plinking. The Germans had no air cover whatsoever. We would dive from 8,000 feet, release our rockets at 2,000 feet, and pull up. Below us, German vehicles burned for miles. The most devastating air raid occurred on December 26th, when 294 RAF Lancaster bombers attacked German positions around St. Vith, dropping 140 tons of bombs. Every road within a 3-kilometer radius became utterly impassable. Unteroffizier Hans Behrens of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division survived the raid. The earth erupted, buildings disintegrated into dust, men simply vanished, vaporized. When it was over, I crawled from my shelter to find a landscape like the surface of the moon. General McAuliffe specifically credited the 19th Tactical Air Command. If it had not been for your splendid cooperation, we should never have been able to hold out. Throughout the siege, something profound had been occurring within the German forces, a psychological shift that Allied intelligence would not fully grasp until after the war. German soldiers had launched the offensive filled with propaganda about weak, spoiled Americans who would crumble at the first sign of real combat. But their experience at Bastogne shattered these illusions completely. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 26th Volksgrenadier wrote to his wife on December 24th. The letter was later found on his body. The Americans are not what we were led to believe. They fight like devils. Yesterday, I witnessed a single American machine gun crew hold off an entire company for 3 hours. Major von der Heide of the Panzer Lehr Division was captured on December 27th. His interrogation statement was astonishing. You have won not because of your numbers or your weapons, but because of your spirit. At Bastogne, we learned that American soldiers are warriors. While the defense of Bastogne grabbed the headlines, Patton's relief operation signified something even more remarkable: a revolution in operational warfare. The statistics remain mind-boggling. In a mere 72 hours, Patton's Third Army had moved 250,000 men over 100-plus miles of frozen roads, repositioned 133,000 vehicles without a single major traffic jam, laid 20,000 miles of telephone wire, established 70 new ammunition supply points, created 40 fuel dumps containing 500,000 gallons of gasoline, set up 20 field hospitals, delivered 4,000 tons of ammunition, and distributed 62,000 maps. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's G2 intelligence officer, later wrote, "What Patton accomplished in those 3 days should have been impossible. We calculated it would take a minimum of 6 days just to plan such a movement." The secret was preparation. Unbeknownst to most, Patton had been wargaming this exact scenario for 2 weeks. While other generals dismissed the notion of a German offensive, Patton had ordered his staff to create detailed contingency plans. The medical accomplishments during the siege warrant special recognition. Despite the capture of most of their medical supplies and personnel on December 19th, doctors and medics saved lives at an extraordinary rate. Major Douglas Kendrick, the chief surgeon of the 101st Airborne, performed 167 operations in 10 days, many of them without proper anesthetic. We operated by candlelight when the generators failed. We used cognac from Belgian homes when the morphine ran out. Technical Sergeant Eugene Rowe of Easy Company treated over 200 wounded men during the siege, often crawling through intense artillery bombardments to reach casualties. He never carried a weapon, only his medical supplies. The successful defense of Bastogne and Patton's subsequent relief operation had consequences that echoed far beyond the tactical victory. Hitler's Grand Offensive, designed to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, had been stopped dead in its tracks. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall German commander in the West, admitted during his post-war interrogation, "Bastogne was the graveyard of the Ardennes offensive. We needed that road junction by December 18th. When the Americans held out for a week and were then reinforced, we knew the offensive had failed." The Germans had committed their entire strategic reserve, 25 divisions, to this final gamble. In 6 weeks of brutal fighting, they suffered between 81,000 and 98,000 casualties, lost over 600 tanks and assault guns, and 1,000 aircraft. These were losses from which Germany could never recover. American casualties were also severe, with approximately 75,000 killed, wounded, or missing, including 19,000 killed. But America could absorb these losses. By January 1945, fresh divisions were arriving from the United States at a rate of 1 per week. More importantly, the offensive had completely exhausted Germany's last reserves. When the Soviets launched their massive winter offensive on January 12, 1945, Germany had no strategic reserves left to shift to the east. The road to Berlin was now open. The Battle of Bastogne forged legends that endure to this day. McAuliffe's "nuts" reply became enshrined in American military folklore as the ultimate expression of defiance. Patton's relief march became a textbook example of operational brilliance, studied in military academies worldwide. In December 1984, veterans from both sides of the conflict returned to Bastogne for the 40th anniversary. Former adversaries met as friends. General McAuliffe, then 87, delivered the keynote address. "We fought here not for conquest, but for freedom. We fought not from hatred, but from duty. And when it was over, we helped rebuild what war had destroyed." Former Hauptmann Hans Dittmer of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, who returned for the anniversary, stated, "I came here as a conqueror in 1944. I return now as a friend. The Americans we fought showed us what democracy truly means. Not weakness, but strength." Today, the Mardasson Memorial stands proudly on a hill overlooking Bastogne, a star-shaped monument that honors the 76,190 American soldiers who fell in the Battle of the Bulge. Every December 16th at 5:30 a.m., the precise moment the German offensive began, bells toll throughout Bastogne. In the town square sits the Sherman tank Barracuda from the 11th Armored Division. Children now play on it, climbing over the very same armor that liberated their grandparents. Vincent Speranza, the paratrooper who famously brought beer to wounded soldiers, returned to Bastogne many times before his passing. The town's brewery even created Airborne beer in his honor. During his final visit in 2019 at the age of 96, he raised a glass and declared, "To the boys who didn't come home, to the people who never forgot, to freedom." The final statistics of the Bastogne operation remain staggering. American forces at Bastogne. Initial garrison of 18,000, including 11,840 from the 101st Airborne. Combat Command B, 10th Armored with 40 operational tanks. Total American casualties at Bastogne, approximately 4,500. German forces committed to Bastogne, an initial force of 25,000 to 30,000, eventually swelling to approximately 55,000. German casualties around Bastogne, 15,000 plus. Tanks lost, over 100. Patton's relief force, 250,000 men pivoted north. 133,000 vehicles moved. A 100-plus mile advance in severe winter conditions. Breakthrough achieved in 5 days. Supply operations, 200 tons delivered by air. 961 C-47 sorties flown, with 241 aircraft on December 23 alone. A 95% recovery rate of airdropped supplies. Weather data: 168 consecutive hours below freezing. Lowest temperature, approximately 10 degrees hours. Visibility from December 19th to 22nd, less than 100 yards. Clear weather began on December 23rd. Winston Churchill, addressing Parliament in January 1945, declared, "This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery conceded, "The Americans at Bastogne wrote one of the finest chapters in military history. Their stand will be remembered as long as men honor courage." But perhaps the most poignant tribute came from former Wehrmacht General Heinrich von Luttwitz, whose 47th Panzer Corps had encircled Bastogne. In 1954, while visiting the memorial, he rendered a salute and said, "They were magnificent enemies who became better friends. They fought not for conquest, but for principle. That is why they deserved to win." The German forces that had derided the Americans trapped at Bastogne learned a profound lesson in those frozen December days of 1944. They learned that free men fighting for one another are stronger than any army fighting for conquest. They learned that determination matters more than sheer numbers. They learned that when democracy is pushed to the brink, it pushes back with a force that tyranny can never hope to match. The relief of Bastogne stands as enduring proof that freedom, when truly threatened, will always find its champions. In December 1944, Those champions wore the screaming eagle of the 101st Airborne and the triangle of Patton's Third Army. They were teenagers from Iowa farms and New York tenements, from Texas ranches and California factories. They were America. On a quiet hill just outside Bastogne, a single foxhole is preserved, exactly as it was in December 1944. A plaque beside it bears a simple inscription, words spoken by a young paratrooper whose name has been lost to history, but whose spirit will live forever. They've got us surrounded. The poor bastards. That magnificent defiance, that absolute refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable, that was the spirit of Bastogne. It was the spirit that held the line against tyranny. It was the spirit that brought Patton's tanks roaring through the snow. And when the moment of truth arrived, when freedom itself hung in the balance, they answered with a single word that will echo through eternity: nuts. The German mockery died in the snows around Bastogne, buried beneath the thunder of Patton's advancing tanks and the unconquerable spirit of surrounded paratroopers who simply refused to quit. In its place grew respect, then admiration, and finally, friendship. The fortress of democracy had held, the arsenal of freedom had triumphed, and in that triumph, the future of the free world was secured.